Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, another ESPN article that lists the Wolves as one of the teams that lost the most roster value this offseason. I'll talk about why that's extremely misleading. I disagree with the overall characterization of the Wolves. I'll tell you why next.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hopefully you have had a fantastic week so far. And the Timberwolves play preseason basketball tomorrow against the LA Clippers. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Not that there's like a whole lot to preview for a preseason game. We'll talk about maybe what to expect. The Clippers, of course, had a nice offseason themselves. In fact, we will talk about them throughout the show today a little bit. Mostly what I want to do today is there's another ESPN article that came out kind of previewing the season, and yet another ESPN article that is relatively critical of the Timberwolves. Now, this one is, in theory, more mathematically based, more analytically inclined. I'll explain what ESPN is trying to do here, but it's an article about the teams that gained or lost the most roster value this offseason. Minnesota finds themselves in the bottom 5 in terms of roster value added, or I guess another way to say that would be in the top 5 of most roster value lost this offseason. I'll explain why that is, and I understand the method here, but I disagree with the conclusion, and I'll explain what's missing here as well. We'll talk a little bit more about the Timberwolves in transition as well. I talked about this a lot on yesterday's show, and there just so happened to be an article that came out during the day on Thursday, so after my show posted, where John Krasinski talked a lot about, it was an article a lot about Mike Conley, and it got into the Timberwolves transition and some stuff that they did not well last year that they're going to change this year, and it plays into what I talked about on yesterday's show. So we'll revisit some of that stuff here in a little bit as well, and then close with a bit of what to expect here this weekend as preseason kicks off for the Wolves. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. You can watch on YouTube. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So this article at ESPN, it is titled NBA Teams That Gained or Lost the Most Roster Value This Offseason. The idea is using the metric they're using is estimated Raptor wins above replacement. Okay, so if you're a baseball fan, wins above replacement's been around for, 20 plus years now for baseball. It's newer for basketball, and this is a specific version of WAR. This is obviously one metric, and I always feel the need to say, I love analytics. I think they're great. There's no one statistic that tells you everything. There's issues with every single, quote unquote catch-all. And it's important to paint a picture by looking at multiple, right? Like there's pros and cons to using, like win shares and WAR and Raptor stuff and box score plus minus and advanced plus minus and, PER and like all these different numbers. It all matters. But context matters too. And when if you want to look at all the catch-alls and try and figure out the real adjusted plus minus from ESPN, which I don't think they do anymore, but that was a good one. I thought was a fairly accurate catch-all. It can help paint a picture, right? So this article is using one of those metrics, which is, I guess, my first thing is like, hey, we're just using one stat to say whether teams are better or worse than last year. Okay. The other thing is it's only measuring guys that are new or have left the roster. So it's not factoring in guys who are going to get an expanded role on the roster, for instance. So like for the Wolves, top losses, of course, are Nickeil Alexander-Walker and then also Josh Minott. It doesn't have Luka Garza listed. But top additions, it's only Jean Beringer that's listed. And somehow they're projecting his WAR at a 0.3, which is obviously basically nothing. It's actually lower than Josh Minott's expected loss. So it doesn't account for the players who will actually be playing in place of Nickeil Alexander-Walker because Minnesota didn't add anybody else to the roster. They didn't add any veterans that weren't on the roster last year, right? They re-signed Joe Ingles. They brought back Bones Highland, neither of whom are likely to be in the rotation. They drafted a pair of rookies in Beranger and Rocco Zikarsky. Zikarsky's on a two-way deal. They brought back two-way deal guys. Well, I guess Enrique Freeman wasn't on the team, but he's still a two-way guy. They brought back the other two-way and Tristan Newton. So there's no net new guys on the roster, but those Nickeil minutes aren't getting taken by Jean Beranger. They're getting taken by guys who are already on the roster that have played smaller roles last year that will have expanded roles this year. And sure, that's a hard thing to calculate if you're looking at an advanced metric like WAR. But how are you calculating the rookie in Jean Beranger then? Like, why do we think he's worth a plus 0.3, but we don't, there's nothing being estimated for TJ Shannon or Rob Dillingham or Jalen Clark because those guys were already on the roster. So I think that's a blind spot here with this exercise. I'll read what they say about the Wolves. It says the T-Wolves went into the summer with a lot of uncertainty about which supporting players will be coming back. In that sense, they arguably did the best they could without going into the second apron by re-signing Julius Randle and Naz Reid. But it did come at the cost of losing Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who had 7.1 total WAR, and with whom the team was an average of plus 4 net points per 100 possessions on the court versus off over the past 2 seasons. It's hardly an earth-shattering loss, but it speaks to the depth that can be a casualty of the luxury tax in the current NBA. Okay, I don't disagree with any of that in the write-up. And again, this is supposed to be a cold, hard calculus of what happened here. So it's not factoring in the promotion from within. It's not factoring in the context of, hey, they did as good as they could have, which is what is acknowledged here in this. I think Neil Payne did the article for ESPN. It's acknowledged in the write-up that, hey, look, they could have lost more guys, right? They had to pick 2 of 3, essentially, between Julius Randle, Naz Reid, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and they picked the 2 big men with the, I think, correct calculation that you can backfill those Nickeil minutes better, and also the current roster is much better suited. Like, who would have been the Randle and Reid replacements? Like, Beranger's not ready. Like there isn't anybody, right? They weren't going to re-sign Luka Garza to replace one of those guys. I mean, that would have been a bigger drop-off than trying to Band-Aid over the former non-minutes with some combination of TJ Shannon and Jalen Clark and Rob Dillingham. That was obviously the calculus. We talked a ton about that this summer. So given that context, and given the promotion from within and the young talent that appears to be ready to graduate from fringe rotation minutes to actual rotation minutes, and especially TJ Shannon, I don't think anyone with a straight face would be able to be like, yeah, the Wolves had a bottom 5 offseason this year. You know, bad offseason for Minnesota. No. And to be clear, that's not what this article's doing. It's just misleading. Because the overall roster value that left isn't being filled by new guys. It's being filled from guys who are improving, guys who are growing in their careers, guys who have been in the system for the last couple of years. They didn't bring in, you know, a washed up vet. They didn't it's just not a accurate representation of what the Wolves roster looks like now compared to what it looked like on, you know, June 1st. So it's one of the, that same continuity is exactly, you know, one of the reasons why I'm high on the Wolves to hit the over this year. There's one other thing I wanted to mention here, and it's certainly something I mentioned before, but another thing that's not factored in here when you look at the totality of like, hey, are the Wolves going to be better or worse this coming year than last year? And, you know, what does this roster look like compared to last year's? One other thing that is kind of naturally overlooked with this exercise, given how it was handled, and we'll hit that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Monarch Money. Most people cannot name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. And that's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you put off organizing your finances, Monarch is for you. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever even touching a spreadsheet. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with the code LOCKEDONNBA. All right, So last thing I want to hit related to where my issue with this ESPN kind of synopsis of the Timberwolves offseason, which I think that's a pretty fair way to uh, frame this, is not only is it not taking into account internal improvement from guys who weren't in the rotation, and it's not taking into account, well, I mean, that's the biggest thing, but it's also like it's well, that's the biggest issue. The other thing is the natural improvement of the guys who are already in the rotation. Because again, it's overall roster value that they're looking at, not simply, is Anthony Edwards going to be better this year? But it's what I keep coming back to when I talk about the overall, win total and the championship odds. Like the idea that Ant isn't going to be better in age 25 season than he was in his age 24 season because he's gotten progressively better each of the last 4 or 5 years is crazy. I mean, the way the Wolves make the jump from conference finals team to a finals team to a champion, from a 49 win regular season team back to a high 50s win team up to 60 wins, perhaps, is natural improvement progression by Anthony Edwards, who's one of the very best young players in the entire NBA, a top 5 player, consensus top 6 player. He was 6th in all NBA vote in each of the last 2 years, 6th on the Locked On NBA top 100 voting, 6th or 7th on the ESPN list. He's going to be better this year. And if he makes the leap from all-star to MVP candidate, from second team All-NBA to first team All-NBA, then this team will be better, not worse. And that doesn't include, what does Jaden McDaniels do in his age 25, I think it is, season? He's getting better too. He made his biggest jump yet last year. What if he makes another jump similar to that? So if you factor in natural internal improvement from the young stars already on the roster, you factor in their backfilling Nickeil Alexander-Walker's minutes with young players already in the system who are growing and improving, who showed flashes as limited time players last year, but now as rotation guys are going to be more valuable than, say, bringing in a vet minimum type guy. That kind of overtakes some of these other concerns. So I think it's just a misleading analysis of what this offseason looks like. Other bottom 5 teams for the offseason, the Cleveland Cavaliers are one of them. That one's kind of obvious. Losing Ty Jerome and Isaac Okoro both really hurts. Milwaukee Bucks, that's an obvious one too. The Phoenix Suns, perhaps the most obvious. And then the Boston Celtics, who outside of the Jason Tatum injury, I mean, the other guys that left, Kristaps Porzingis, Drew Holiday, Luke Cornett, and Al Horford all gone, is huge on top of the injury to Jason Tatum. And they brought in some pretty good players. Anthony Simons, Chris Boucher, both nice players. And then, of course, Josh Minott, Luka Garza. But everyone they brought in is worse than everyone that is out for the season, or gone or out for the season. So that's not surprising. The 5 teams that added the most value, I think this was also interesting. We'll talk about the Clippers here in a minute. They were number 1. The Rockets were number 2. And I've talked extensively on the show. Yeah, they'll be good this year. They were good last year. They were the 2 seed last year. But I don't think they're going to be dramatically better. I think there's enough question marks with how Kevin Durant and Amen Thompson played together and the depth beyond the starting lineup. The bench is good. I just don't know that they're going to be that much better than last year's team. They lost some guys that matter too. Like Dylan Brooks mattered a lot to that team. Jalen Green, in some senses, there were issues that maybe subtracting him is better, but like he's still a rotation guy that was a big part of their team last year. Dallas is number 3, projecting out what Cooper Flagg can bring to the table. They really only lost Spencer Dinwiddie as far as rotation guys, and then they also added D'Lo. Brooklyn is 4th, and Charlotte is 5th. Both teams that in the East, I mean, who knows? They could be playoff teams in the Eastern Conference. So that's what that list looks like. We'll close by talking Clippers, so I'll hit some of the Clippers stuff at the end as we look ahead to Saturday night's preseason game. I'm going to transition directly into something I talked about on yesterday's show, and that's the Timberwolves as a team being better in transition. The quick synopsis of what I really focused on yesterday was, and that was part of a bigger conversation. Of course, we talked about Rudy Gobert lineups. We talked about really it was the things that I thought Minnesota would be better at this year than last year that could surprise. And one of them was free throw rate. I think Minnesota will get to the line a lot more. And then one of the other big things was just getting out in transition and running more. But part of that conversation yesterday was looking back at last season. Minnesota was a lot better offensively with Gobert off the floor than they had been with Gobert off the floor the year before. I'm not comparing Rudy on off last year. I'm comparing Rudy off the floor in 24-25 and Rudy off the floor in 23-24. And the offense was significantly better. And it was a big reason why Minnesota's offense went from middle of the pack, 15, 16, 17, 2 years ago in offensive rating to top 10 last year. I think 8th is where they ended up offensively. And a huge piece of that was the offense with Rudy off the floor. And a huge piece of that was playing in transition and how fast they played when Rudy was off the floor. They were really good with Rudy off the floor last season. Minnesota still didn't run that much, but their transition offense was that much better. And the reason why what I posited yesterday on the show was, hey, Julius, if Rudy's off the floor, that means some combination of Naz Reid and Julius Randle most of the time are in the front court. Perhaps with Jaden McDaniels at the 4. In some instances with early in the season, Joe Ingles at the 4, Josh Minott at the 4. But in general, Naz Reid and Julius Randle, at least one of those guys was on the floor pretty much at all times when Rudy was off the floor. And the pace got pushed a little more, but at least a little bit more effectively because Julius Randle, especially, he's a legit point forward. That's what he wants to do and he's good at. And you had bigs that wanted to lead the break and be involved versus Gobert getting the board and then waiting for a guard and getting it to them and running the half-court offense. So something that I thought was pretty fascinating that was included, this is a John Krasinski article at The Athletic. Of course, John does a great job covering the Wolves. I'm not going to read too much from this because, of course, it's an Athletic article, so it's behind a paywall. But there's very similar stuff in here about how the Wolves were overall 27th in transition opportunities last season, but 3rd in efficiency. And according to John's article, it says, according to the team's internal tracking data, remember, I pulled this on Cleaning the Glass yesterday, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but it was basically the same, bottom 5 in opportunities. In fact, dead last in running off of rebounds, defensive rebounds, but really good in efficiency. They score when they do run. And then a stat I didn't have yesterday at my fingertips that is fascinating, John's got in his piece here. This says, quote, one of Finch's go-to statistics has been that the Wolves are in the top 5 last season for passes that went backward. Oftentimes, when Rudy Gobert would grab a defensive rebound, Edwards, Conley, and Julius Randle would all come back for the ball. So one of the first edicts of camp so far has been that if Gobert grabs a rebound and Conley is on the floor, he is the only one who should be going back to get the ball. Finch wants everyone else sprinting up the floor for hit-ahead passes in hopes of creating more transition chances. That makes a ton of sense. I did not have the backwards pass stat on my radar, but it makes a lot of sense. It does. I mean, if you go back and watch what the Wolves did last year, Gobert would get a rebound and he would, everyone would come back to the ball because they naturally want the ball. Everybody wants to initiate the offense. Micah Nori, the Timberwolves top assistant in this article, has a quote about how, look, Randle and Edwards are not going to lose shot opportunities if we push the ball forward. If Gobert gives the ball to Ant and Ant brings it up the floor, that doesn't mean Ant's going to get a shot off, right? The ball's going to find Ant. Chris Finch always talks about in the half court, if Edwards gets off the ball will find him, right? If he gets off the ball early and cuts away or, rotates to the corner, the ball's going to come back to Ant at some point in the possession more often than not. The ball will find you if you get off the ball early and it gets back to you. And a lot of times then the defense isn't able to load up. They're not able to double. They're not able to have as strong of gap help. And you can rip it and go on that kind of, second side reaction when the ball swings back to you if you're Anthony Edwards. And similar to that, the point that Nori is making here is, look, you get that hit-ahead pass. If Conley's coming back to the ball, that means 2 of the other 3 guys running down the floor, Julius Randle and Anthony Edwards, the other's Jaden McDaniels. All guys that you want getting the ball in stride when Conley's running a break with Rudy as a trail man. And that's all they're trying to do here. There's a ton of upside there. This is obviously with Gobert on the floor. There's a lot of upside there for Minnesota in transition. I want to talk a couple more notes on that, and then we'll move into talking about Saturday's game against the Nuggets. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. The NFL season is more than just here. It is now into week 5, a fantastic overtime game Thursday night, by the way. Rams and 49ers, a really fun game. Obviously, two of the best, 6, 7 teams in the entire NFL. Your Buffaloes, your Baltimore's been bad so far, but Buffalo's up there. The Packers, I know they struggled recently. They're going to be up there. My mind's blanking out on the other good teams in the NFL. There's lots of good teams in the NFL, but two of them played Thursday night. It was a lot of fun. And I did say before the game that I would have taken 49ers plus 6.5 at LA. And guess what? That turned out okay. They ended up winning that game outright. You could look at Vikings Browns early Sunday. Vikings are 3.5-point favorites in Europe against Cleveland. I kind of sort of would take Cleveland plus 3.5. Vikings could win by a field goal. I see that, but I think Cleveland could cover that 3.5. You can bet the games ahead of time. You can do same game parlays. You can live bet the games. Ton of fun with the overseas games early on Sunday. No matter what you want to do, though, don't wait any longer. Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get yourself started. All right. A couple more notes here on transition. I thought the piece by John was really good, and there were some quotes in there from Mike Conley as well. And Conley talks about how he wants to play quarterback. He talks about how he holds himself accountable and didn't do a great job last year holding himself accountable and staying active in the offense. And the article is really more about Mike Conley than anything else. But instead of just standing in the corner, how can he stay active, be passing and cutting, relocating and spotting up, which is all true. And Conley seems to think, look, I got this. I can be myself for one more year. I can be more like remember how good Conley was the second half of last year. He was miserable. He was like the worst 2-point shooter in the entire league early in the season. He was shooting like 30-ish% from 3. But then after January 1st, he was awesome. And if the Wolves can get that version of Mike Conley, and again, I said this the other day, but I think defensively is where the biggest concern comes with Mike Conley, and where the being a step slower pops up a bit more obviously is on defense. But if he can more than hold his own, or just even really just hold his own there this year, I think that's going to be really positive. He's got some quotes in here about Rob Dillingham wanting to be great, and Rob Dillingham wanting to play well, to do great things, and how he's kind of helping him prep for that. So that'll be a fun thing to watch, is how much opportunity does Dillingham get? Does Conley really have one more strong year in him? And at the same time, will we get to see Dillingham try and assert himself on the floor with rotation guys and show any growth that he's had since last year? But a really good piece by John, and some interesting context, additional context to the transition stuff. Again, a lot of it I hit yesterday, but the concept of guys not coming back to the ball is not something I talked about. And I thought that stat from Chris Finch, as told by John Krasinski of The Athletic, was pretty fascinating. That Minnesota's basically like, hey, let's not throw the ball backwards anymore. Let's just keep things going up the court. And we don't need anyone except for Mike coming back to get the ball from Rudy or whoever rebounded it. If it's Julius Randle, then, ideally it's Gobert getting the rebounds. Then your 3 guys running are Randle, McDaniels, Ant, or, whoever, but you're not worried about Gobert getting out in transition necessarily. But I thought that was an interesting observation that the Wolves coaching staff made, and clearly, very obviously, a focus for Minnesota as they head into the season for how they want to attack transition. And as I said yesterday, I liken this a little bit to the offensive rebounding stuff that started in January for Minnesota, where Chris Finch was like, all right, we're going to be an offensive rebounding team now. We're going to change how we do this schematically and just start crashing the glass on offense. And I think this could be a similar thing where, like, hey, look, instead of being a slow it down half court team, instead of getting the ball to the right ball handler in the backcourt, let's just get the ball up the floor, get a hit ahead pass, get a corner 3, get a dunk, get to the line. And I think that'll be a really fun approach, and an effective approach too. Saturday, Timberwolves and Nuggets from San Diego. It's very confusing. I've said multiple times on the show it's the Clippers, because of course the Clippers used to play in San Diego, not for a long time, but we get Wolves Nuggets from San Diego. The first time the Wolves have ever played in San Diego. It is a 8 p.m. Central tip on Saturday. I don't believe that there's video of this unless League Pass has it, but there's of course audio, there's radio, on all the various places you can listen to Wolves games in the Twin Cities. So that should be a lot of fun. Of course, no expectations for really anything other than hopefully getting to see some of the young guys play. Too bad Leonard Miller's out with the finger laceration, but will we get to see some Beranger? Will we get to see more Rob? I think we'll see a lot of Rob Dillingham if I had to guess. So that'll be a lot of fun on Saturday. I'll try and get my hands on a feed for that, and maybe I'm just missing it. It is on, but I'll try and watch the game before Monday. So the Monday show can be a bit of a recap of the weekend and what happened on Saturday for the Wolves in their game against the Nuggets. I said earlier, I got it messed up earlier. I said we talk more about the Clippers. The Wolves aren't playing the Clippers at all. They're playing the Nuggets. But you know what? The Nuggets, that's also an interesting one, that the Nuggets aren't on this list for adding war to their roster. They're not even mentioned in like the who's not here section on the ESPN article, which is kind of crazy because I thought the Nuggets had a really nice offseason. The Clippers stuff, of course, is mostly tied to Chris Paul, and really Brook Lopez has a higher WAR number on here than Bradley Beal, which I'm completely on board with. And also John Collins. Losing Norman Powell, like he's the only significant guy the Clippers lost. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. And I also just apparently think the Clippers still play in San Diego. So here we are. Apologies for that mix-up. But Wolves, Nuggets had a great offseason. And, it doesn't really matter in the preseason. Like I'm sure, I shouldn't say I'm sure. I'd be surprised if like Jokic and Ant, played more than half of a quarter. It's just a time to get out there and run up and down a little bit. So nothing really to like lock in on in this one. And Minnesota's preseason schedule, they play 6 preseason games this year. Their next one's on Tuesday, and that's against the Pacers. So a couple of teams that actually their preseason schedule is quote unquote really hard. They're like good teams from last year, which is nice. Even if it's preseason, they're going to be prepared and all that stuff too. So it'll be a pretty good, kind of snapshot of where Minnesota sits as of right now. All right. That's all I got for you today. We'll talk about Saturday's game on Monday's show. Of course, we're daily Monday through Friday, and we'll be back throughout all of next week as the preseason schedule rolls on. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Show. Josh Lloyd hosts the #1 fantasy basketball podcast, giving you daily tips and helping you win your league, all while making you a smarter NBA fan. You can find Locked On Fantasy Basketball on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Of course, this show is also part of that very same network, your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.